Good day. I'm Liesl Pretorius, Head of Legal with Freedom of Religion, South Africa. Today, I'm speaking to my colleague, 4SA Executive Director Michael Swain, about church autonomy and the state regulation of religion. Now, state regulation of religion is not only a freedom of religion concern, but it's also a democratic and constitutional concern. And thankfully, in South Africa, religious institutions still enjoy a very high degree of autonomy, and 4SA intends helping to ensure that it stays that way. But beyond our borders, more than one African democracy is facing pressure to impose state regulation of religion, and some states have already imposed this in their jurisdictions. So, to talk about this, let's start off. Good day, Michael. Can you tell us what is religious or church autonomy?
Oh, thank you, Liesl. And this is a really interesting discussion. It's probably one of the central elements of religious freedom, because our courts have always held the view that the judiciary should not involve itself, and therefore politicians in general should not involve themselves in the internal matters of a religious organization. And this is referred to as the doctrine of entanglement. A very key case, which 4SA was actually part of, was the case of De Lange against the presiding bishop of the Methodist Church. And this was a key case which basically set out very clearly the parameters of this doctrine. It says that a court should only become involved in a dispute whether it is strictly necessary for it to do so. And even then, and I'm quoting from the judgment, it should refrain from determining doctrinal issues to avoid entanglement. It would thus seem, the judge went on to say, that a proper respect for freedom of religion precludes the courts from pronouncing on matters of religious doctrine which fall within the exclusive realm of the church. And it's important to note that in a previous constitutional court case, freedom of religion has been defined as your right to believe whatever you want to believe, essentially, even if that belief is bizarre, irrational, illogical, or incapable of any scientific evidence. So it is very important that courts and the law in general stays clear of prescribing what should or should not happen within religious organizations, because in all cases, the religious organizations, let's say, internal rules and processes and procedures will be a reflection of its beliefs. And therefore, to involve yourself in trying to interpret or engage or judge what a church actually practices internally will almost certainly be a judgment on what it actually believes. So hence why very key that the courts and the state generally stays out of the, let's say, the parameters of church autonomy, unless, of course, there's clearly some contradiction of law.
Of course. So, Michael, it would seem, and this is definitely 4SA position, that religious autonomy is important. But for viewers who might not be so familiar with the importance of religious autonomy, the reasons why it is important, could you unpack that for us a bit more?
Yeah, the Constitution has Section 31, which also is reflective of international law. And this specifically recognizes the rights of religious freedom to not be limited to individual, but it also extends collectively to religious communities, to associations, and obviously, therefore, to churches. And again, this is because religious communities, through absolute necessity, must be able to organize together collectively in order to practice and to exercise their right to religious freedom. And so this means that they have the right to form or to join or to maintain religious associations. And by the way, this would also include faith-based schools. And it also, by the way, includes the right for them to exclude non-adherents of their faith and their belief and their doctrine from joining. In fact, that's actually part of your religious freedom, is to not join a particular religious organization or church that does not reflect your views and values. If you know a church or you are in a church that starts to preach or teach something which you fundamentally don't agree with from a faith point of view, well, your right to religious freedom is to actually find a place of worship which does reflect or better match your views. It does not mean that you have the right to now somehow go to court to overturn that religious institution or that church's autonomy to essentially preach and teach and practice and believe what it sees fit.
So at the intro, Michael, I mentioned that we're talking about church autonomy and state regulation of religion, and that thankfully we don't have this in South Africa. But what is state regulation of religion exactly?
Well, this is essentially where the state decides to interfere in a religious group's operation or in individuals' decisions to practice their religion or their ability to practice their religion. Interestingly enough, it also includes, for example, if the state particularly favors any religion or belief or, let's say, ideology. And it specifically, state regulation of religion would stop governments from actually becoming involved in forcing any type of conformity onto the religious sector. For instance, one of the things that we were deeply opposed to, and we can get onto that, is where the government, for example, says that it wants certain provisions to be included in every church organization's constitution, not where obviously that includes things like taxation or SARS issues or what have you, but certainly where it starts to actually infringe on the area where the church's operations are guided and directed by what they believe.
Yes, that's very important. Michael, so obviously, state regulation of religion doesn't just come out of the blue, and governments will often provide reasons for why they think religion should be regulated in their country. And there probably are typical trends, typical justifications that are offered. So, what are these reasons usually given, and do you believe that these justifications are valid?
Yeah, there are a number of reasons, and of course, they all sound really great up front. For example, one of the reasons that's often given is that somehow, and very often, by the way, this is put to the church, the Christian church particularly, and government will come to the Christian church and they'll say, listen, we've noticed that there are some mushroom churches, some charlatans who are bringing the doctrine of the Christian church and the faith of the Christian church into disrepute. And we think that it would be best if we collaborate to identify who should or should not be teaching and preaching and what they should or should not be teaching and preaching, because that would, of course, help you, church, to ensure that there's some form of doctrinal conformity. Sounds great until, of course, you start looking at historical examples. So, going right back to the Reformation, you had the predominant faith of the Catholic Church, and then you have this pesky, annoying character called Martin Luther, who starts to challenge the doctrinal orthodoxy of the Catholic faith. And he is, of course, immediately accused of heresy, and the full weight of the state is then turned against him and what he believes. Of course, unfortunately, what happened in that, and this was a key part of the Reformation, was that it literally led to a couple of centuries of bloody warfare. And of course, every time the state got behind any religious grouping, and by the way, that included the Lutherans, it always ends horribly for someone. So when the Lutheran Church starts to become established and it gets that place of preeminence and it gets state backing, another grouping comes along, happened to be the Anabaptists, and the Lutherans then use the power of the state ruthlessly to suppress their particular emphasis on doctrine. Same thing happened in America when the Puritans had escaped religious persecution and set up their colonies in Massachusetts. And then another, let's say, faith movement, the Quakers, then started to come into their territory and started to preach and teach their view of the Christian faith. And again, it ended up with the execution of 4 Quakers. And that day, by the way, is commemorated now as International Religious Freedom Day. So whenever the state gets behind any particular religious organization or faith or ideology, it's always going to end horribly badly for someone. And so that's exactly why you should always keep the state away from endorsing or backing any particular religious organization. Another area, perhaps, which is worth looking at, is what about the constitutionality of it? As we've mentioned, the Constitution is very clear in that it protects religious freedom. And therefore, it is unnecessary in that sense, or unconstitutional for the state to interfere. It is unnecessary. By the way, The other thing that they do, of course, is they point out, well, these terrible things are happening in the religious sector. We had in South Africa, the prophet of doom who sprayed insecticide and claimed that this was somehow going to heal people. People were eating snakes and drinking petrol and eating grass and all sorts of other crazy things. Every one of those things was unlawful, illegal, in fact, in many cases, criminal. So the problem is often that the law is not being enforced properly. And somehow state regulation of religion is going to put this wonderful covering that's going to solve all the problems. Not at all. It's literally putting a band-aid over an open wound. If you're not prepared to enforce the existing laws of the country to prevent abuses in the name of religion, and of course you can never, ever justify a criminal or an unlawful act and say somehow it's my freedom of religion. That is never a defense. You cannot cloak your unlawful act with some religious freedom mantle to try and claim that it's acceptable. It isn't, and it never will be, and it never has been. But of course, when these things start to happen, state regulation supposedly is going to fix it all. Obviously, it won't. If you're not enforcing existing laws, how on earth are you going to enforce state regulation of religion in any event? And it's almost unworkable. I mean, there are over 200,000 churches in South Africa. Having to register every one of those and keep track of every one of those, how are you going to do that? But what it does do, it potentially gives the state the opportunity to cherry pick and to target religious organizations or even religious leaders whose views and whose viewpoints it doesn't like. And that, unfortunately, has been the case in other nations as well.
Yes, so it does seem that state regulation of religion is problematic in general and in principle. And as you've mentioned, history is full of examples of how it goes horribly wrong when the state uses its secular power to intervene in the practice of religion, and particularly where it backs a specific religion or specific expression of religion. But I think we also need to be mindful of the interconnectedness between religious freedom and other rights, freedom of expression, etc. And when the state starts to regulate religion and interferes specifically with the doctrinal issues of churches, when it comes to church positions on membership and leadership and relationships in marriage, that can be very, very problematic. Because freedom of religion is one of the hallmarks and one of the cornerstones of a free and democratic society. So when we see that eroded, or other democratic rights are obviously eroded as well. We've alluded to this, Michael, but maybe you can give us more detail. Has there been attempts to regulate religion in South Africa? And if so, what has been the outcome of that?
Yeah, this was probably one of the major battles that PORSA was involved with. Really began when the Serial Rights Commission, which is an institution of state, it's a Chapter 9 institution, came out with a report entitled The Commercialization of Religion and the Abuse of People's Belief Systems. And what they did, which is pretty much as per form that I've indicated as to how these things come about, is they identified a number of different cases and situations where there had been evident abuses, criminal acts typically, that had taken place. And then they said that the solution to this was to establish peer review committees. Now, a peer review committee, again, sounds great, seems to appeal to people who want, let's say, faith orthodoxy. They said that they would want to appoint representatives of every faith, the Christian faith, and they could decide what is or is not acceptable within their particular faith dispensation. The problem is, and you have to ask them the obvious questions as well, who appoints those particular leaders? And who says that those particular leaders are representative of the Christian faith, all expressions of the Christian faith? And of course, if they're not, then what happens to those with whom they disagree? And the CRL basically decided and stated that it would be, therefore, the final arbiter of religion, which ultimately, of course, means state regulation of religion. And so there was a significant and lengthy battle where ultimately there were 5 days on 3 particular occasions before Parliament where this report was heard, and subsequently there were additional hearings. And happily and thankfully, the attempt to actually impose state regulation of religion was actually thwarted. And so at the moment, and we trust this will continue to be the case, there is no state regulation of religion. But that said, of course, all churches and religious organizations, we all have to be law abiding. There are a lot of regulations that we do have to keep. We obviously have to make sure that our places of worship are safe. We have to make sure that if we employ people, we abide by employment law, that we pay taxes where taxes are due, etc. But the actual regulation of religion was going to involve you actually needing to have a license to be a religious practitioner. That means that if you didn't have a license, if you were considered to be unacceptable, or your doctrine was, then you would not be able to preach and teach whatever it is you believe. And that, of course, is a serious infringement of state regulation of religion. And also, by the way, perhaps worth mentioning at this point, another reason why they often try to say that we need state regulation of religion is they say, well, look, other professions are regulated. Look at lawyers, look at doctors, look at accountants. And the answer to that question is simple. You know, if you're a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant, there is let's say, a body of uniform professional opinion or practice or whatever it may be that actually is agreed upon and is necessary for you to actually effectively do your job. It's a defined body, if you like. Whereas, of course, faith is fluid by nature. You know, the fact that there were at the last count over 40,000 different Christian denominations in the world is pretty clear evidence that we do not agree on everything. And therefore, if there's going to be some kind of like a uniform practice or a uniform theological perspective or position that you must abide by if you're going to be licensed or allowed to be a minister of religion, well, of course, that's immediately going to be an infringement on religious freedom. You cannot cookie cutter, if you like, religious doctrine. It is by definition something which is inherent to you, what you believe, how you believe it, how you express it. As long as you're doing it lawfully, there should be no constraint about what you believe or how you practice that belief.
Yes, it's certainly something to be grateful for. As you said, Michael, that we don't have state regulation of religion in South Africa, but that's also an encouragement to other faith community to self-regulate responsibly and to enjoy our rights and our freedoms that we have responsibly. And it was certainly a victory that 4SA was part of to ensure that uh, churches in South Africa and the faith community in South Africa would not be regulated by the state. But
Mm.
across our borders in Africa, some of our neighbors face a very different situation with some countries considering state regulation of religion and other countries where state regulation of religion has already been imposed with some concerning consequences. Could you enlighten us about these?
Yes, and it is a trend. As I say, it's very much a growing trend, unfortunately. I was actually reminded that when we were in this battle for or against state regulation of religion, the then CRL Rights Commission president, Mrs. Toka, when she was saying to the churches, you know, you need to agree to this because if you don't, look at Rwanda. Uh, that was a direct threat because, well, what is happening in Rwanda? Well, Rwanda have a governance board that has shut down already 5,000 plus churches. And the reason it's done so is because they supposedly don't have adequate infrastructure, or their hygiene is not sufficient, or they don't meet noise requirement, or they don't have the qualified preachers that they need. Effectively, what they're doing is they are imposing standards which are over and above what should be required to simply practice, teach, and preach your faith and live it out. And as a consequence, they are literally shutting down institutions that do not measure up to those standards. And they're often shut down with immediate effect. It's not even a process. It's like one day they're opening, the next day they shut them down. Similar situation in Angola, where you have certain denominations that have been found acting illegally and not meeting regulation requirements and are going to be shut down. Same process is underway in Kenya. There's also in Namibia a process that is now looking to potentially regulate churches by the state, and in Uganda as well. So this is a trend. This is something which is obviously very concerning. Now, we, as you correctly mentioned, and I think it's worthwhile just going back to this, we absolutely believe that churches should be properly constituted, they should be properly compliant, and even in terms of the right to religious freedom, very helpfully, there is a charter of religious freedom, a religious freedom charter that was developed back in the 90s, in fact, that really unpacks what religious freedom should look like. And that has actually already been signed, interestingly enough, in this country by over 20 million people represented across the board. All the different faith groupings and beliefs came together to sign an agreement to say, this is what we understand that religious freedom means. And interestingly enough, part of the process that took place during the debate when we were pushing back against state regulation of religion was the development of a code of conduct by the same organization that actually developed the Religious Freedom Charter. Now, this code of conduct is actually the flip side, if you like, of the rights. It's also the responsibilities. It's the reasonable duties owed. Now, these obviously should be subscribed to on a voluntary basis, but they are very important, and they're actually on our website. If you go to the 4SA website and you look at our resources section, then you can actually click down and you can find both the Religious Freedom Charter and the Code of Conduct. And we believe that's very helpful, as is, of course, educating your calling. If you're called as a pastor or you're called as an imam or whatever faith you're called to, obviously it's going to be helpful if you actually educate yourself more broadly, so that you really do understand the tenets and the theological, let's say, presuppositions behind your faith, so that you don't preach things that are a bit wacky and out of tune. But yes, very important, I think, that we do notice that where state regulation comes into play, immediately and almost inevitably, there is a crackdown on the practice of religion.
Yes. Well, thank you, Michael. This has certainly been an insightful conversation. I think it's important that we are aware of these trends, and I think it's important, as you also emphasized, that we exercise our rights responsibly, our rights and our freedoms. And I would also encourage viewers to have a look at that Religious Freedom Charter. It's on the drop-down resources menu on our website. If you click through to Religious Freedom Charter, you'll find the charter, the code of conduct, etc., and you can familiarize yourself with that. If you're interested in the work that 4SA does, you can learn more about us by visiting our website. The address is www.4sa.org.za. You can subscribe to our newsletter. Our contact details are on the website, other resources, articles, etc. We are also on social media, on YouTube, where you found this video, and also on Facebook at Freedom of Religion SA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Until the next time, and please don't forget to click that important donate button. We are only able to do the work that we do because we receive financial support from you. So please do take advantage of that. Click that support button. We need your help and support. Thank you.